I never imagined my life would turn into the kind of story I am about to tell you. If someone had told me years ago that my marriage would drag me into a world of humiliation, betrayal, and quiet rage, I would have laughed. I was a young woman in love, hopeful and naive. I thought love could conquer everything: cultural differences, generational gaps, family traditions, even jealousy. But love, I've learned, doesn't conquer. It only exposes the fault lines hidden beneath the surface. And once they're exposed, they can split your whole world apart. I was 26 when I married Daniel. I remember standing in front of the mirror on our wedding day, trembling with both fear and excitement. My dress wasn't expensive, but it was mine, and it carried all my dreams stitched into its fabric. Daniel's eyes had lit up when he saw me walking down the aisle. In that moment, I believed everything would be okay. I believed we were building a life together, one that was ours alone. But there was a shadow I didn't fully understand yet. A shadow that wore perfume, pearls, and carried a voice that could slice me into pieces without ever raising its volume. That shadow was my mother-in-law. From the beginning, she carried herself like royalty, with expectations that no one dared to challenge. Her name was Eleanor, though everyone called her Mrs. Whitmore. I thought I could win her over with kindness, with patience, with the sincerity of my heart. I thought she would see me as her son's partner, someone worthy of sharing the Whitmore name. Instead, what she saw in me was competition, intrusion, an outsider who dared to take what she believed belonged only to her, the undivided loyalty of her son. The battles didn't start with fire. They started quietly, with comments dropped like tiny daggers. "Oh, you serving chicken for dinner? Daniel never liked chicken. You must not know him as well as I do." Or, "Your hands are so soft. You must not be used to real work in the kitchen." She smiled as she said these things, smiling like a queen watching a servant squirm. At first, I laughed them off. Daniel told me to ignore her, to be patient. "She'll come around," he promised. But patience became another word for surrender, and slowly I felt myself shrinking inside my own marriage. The moment that changed everything happened on a cold winter night. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. I had just drifted into sleep when I heard it. The sharp tapping of her cane against the hardwood floor. Then her voice, cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Get up," she said. "I want you in the kitchen." I thought I had misheard her. Midnight had just struck. My body ached with exhaustion from the long day of chores and errands she had already demanded of me. But when I opened the bedroom door, she was standing there in her silk robe, eyes cold, mouth set in a line of command. "Cook for me," she ordered. "I want a proper meal. Now." I looked at Daniel, expecting him to intervene, to tell his mother that this was insane. But he rolled over in bed, pretending not to hear. My heart cracked a little in that moment. I realized I was alone. So, I went downstairs. My hands shook as I opened the refrigerator, trying to piece together something edible while my eyes blurred with tears. She sat at the kitchen table, her cane resting against the chair, her gaze never leaving me. Every move I made, every sound of the knife against the cutting board echoed like a judgment. When I placed the food in front of her, she lifted her fork slowly, tasting it with deliberate cruelty. Then she smirked. "Maybe you're not completely useless after all," she whispered. That night became a pattern. Whenever she wanted, no matter the hour, she summoned me. Midnight meals, early morning tea, errands that made no sense. It wasn't about food or tea. It was about power. About reminding me that I was beneath her, that my life belonged to her whims. And every time Daniel turned away, every time he told me to just keep the peace, a part of me died. My marriage bed became a battlefield of silence, my husband a ghost beside me. I began to question myself. Was I too sensitive? Was this the price of being married into a family that valued tradition over compassion? I tried to bury my anger, to smile through my exhaustion. But no matter how deep I buried it, it grew. Anger has a way of seeping through the cracks, feeding on the smallest indignities. And I was drowning in indignities. Years passed like this. People on the outside thought we were the perfect family. We smiled for photographs, hosted dinner parties, played the roles expected of us. No one knew that behind closed doors, I was a servant in my own home. No one knew how many nights I stood barefoot on the cold kitchen tile at midnight, cooking meals for a woman who despised me. But secrets have a way of rotting in silence, and ours was no different. It was a Sunday afternoon when the first real crack appeared in her perfect mask. I was cleaning the attic when I found an old box hidden beneath blankets that smelled of mothballs. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age. They weren't addressed to Eleanor. They were addressed to Daniel's father, and they weren't from Eleanor either. They were from another woman. My hands trembled as I read them, piecing together a story of a love affair that had spanned years. Daniel's father had loved someone else, someone who had begged him to leave his marriage. The letters ended abruptly, with words that hinted at betrayal and heartbreak. I realized then why Eleanor had become the way she was. She wasn't protecting her family's honor. She was clinging to the only thing she had left, control. And I, foolishly, had become her target. For a moment, I felt pity for her. But pity doesn't erase cruelty. Pity doesn't erase the nights I cried alone, the years of silence from the man who swore to protect me. And pity certainly doesn't erase betrayal. Because soon after I discovered another truth, one that burned hotter than any fire I had ever known. Daniel knew. He had known about the letters, about the affair, about the secrets buried in that attic. He had kept it from me, just as he had kept so many things hidden. My husband, the man I thought would stand by me, had chosen silence over honesty. And that silence became betrayal. I remember confronting him, my voice shaking, my chest tight. "Why didn't you tell me?" I cried. He looked at me with those same tired eyes, the eyes that once promised me forever. "Because it doesn't matter," he said. "What's done is done. Don't dig up the past." But the past was already dug up. And it wasn't just Eleanor's past. It was mine, too. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting a cruel mother-in-law. I was fighting a system built on silence, on secrets, on betrayal passed down like an heirloom. The rage that had been simmering inside me for years finally boiled over. I stopped cooking at midnight. I stopped answering her calls. When she summoned me, I locked the bedroom door. Daniel shouted, threatened, begged me to just give in, but I refused. For the first time in years, I chose myself. But revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, like a seed planted in the soil of suffering. I began to gather my strength in silence. I began to plan, not just for survival, but for justice. I didn't know then how far it would go, how deep the secrets truly were, or how much destruction would follow. But I knew one thing. I would no longer be their victim. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, listening to the echo of Eleanor's cane against the floor, I whispered to myself, "This ends with me." I didn't know if that meant freedom, or war, or something in between. But I knew the woman who once trembled in the kitchen at midnight was gone, and in her place was someone stronger, someone ready to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it turned out to be. The day I whispered those words, "This ends with me," was the day I stopped being afraid. But courage doesn't come without cost. The moment I refused to bow to Eleanor's midnight demands, the house shifted into something darker. It was as if the walls themselves carried her fury, and every corner whispered her disapproval. She didn't need to scream to make her rage known. Her silence was sharper, her eyes colder, her smile more venomous. Daniel felt the shift too, though he didn't admit it. He avoided conversations, staying later at work, pretending not to see the battles unfolding under his own roof. I think he believed if he stayed quiet, if he buried himself in his office, everything would balance itself out. But silence only fed the fire, and soon the fire became unbearable. One evening, as I prepared dinner, not because she asked me to, but because I still cared for my own dignity, Eleanor entered the kitchen. She stood there, framed in the doorway, her pearls gleaming against the sharp lines of her black dress. She watched me cut vegetables, her gaze heavy, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with a voice as smooth as poison, she said, "You think you've won something by refusing me, but you've only made things worse for yourself. Do you know why Daniel doesn't defend you? Because deep down, he knows you'll never be enough." Her words sliced through me. I wanted to scream, to throw the knife in my hand onto the counter, to tell her she was wrong. But something inside me froze. She wasn't just taunting me. She was telling me the truth. Daniel had stopped defending me long ago, and what's worse, I had allowed it. I had let silence and fear shrink me down into someone unrecognizable. That night, I didn't cry. For the first time, I sat in the darkness of my room staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of her words settle. But instead of breaking me, they hardened me. I realized I had been waiting for someone to save me, for Daniel, for time, for some miracle of understanding. But no one was coming. If I wanted freedom, if I wanted respect, I would have to carve it out with my own hands. And then fate handed me a weapon I hadn't expected. It was late autumn when Eleanor fell ill. Not gravely, but enough to weaken her, to tether her to her bed for days at a time. Suddenly, the woman who had once commanded me with midnight orders was reduced to whispers, her cane lying unused beside her nightstand. People say illness humbles the proud, but Eleanor's pride was too strong for that. Instead, her weakness made her crueler. She demanded constant attention, nitpicking every detail of her care, insulting the nurses Daniel hired, belittling anyone who entered her room. But with her illness came vulnerability, and with vulnerability came truth. One afternoon, I entered her room to change her water. The curtains were half drawn, the sunlight spilling across her bed. She was staring at a photograph on the nightstand, one I hadn't noticed before. It was a picture of Daniel's father, younger, smiling, his arm wrapped around a woman who was not Eleanor. My heart pounded. I had seen the letters. I knew about the affair. But to see it in a frame by her bedside, hidden away like a wound she couldn't let go of. It was confirmation. When she noticed me looking, she turned the frame face down on the table, her eyes, sharp even in illness, locked onto mine. "Don't you dare speak of it," she hissed. "You don't know what it cost me to keep this family together. You don't know what I've sacrificed, but I did know. I knew she had sacrificed me, my happiness, my dignity, to preserve a family that was already broken long before I entered it." And in that moment, something inside me shifted again. I no longer saw her as the invincible queen who ruled my life. I saw her as a woman, a broken, bitter woman trapped in the ruins of her own lies. Still, pity can be dangerous. It can trick you into lowering your guard, and I should have known better than to trust even her weakness. A week later, Daniel returned home from work earlier than usual. He looked pale, his hands trembling as he dropped a folder of papers onto the dining table. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't answer. Finally, he sat down, burying his face in his hands, and whispered, "She changed the will." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He lifted his head, his eyes hollow. "My mother. She left everything to me. Everything. The house, the accounts, the property. She erased any mention of my sister, my father's family, anyone else who might have had a claim. And she made me promise to keep it that way. I stared at him in disbelief. His sister Caroline had been estranged for years, but she was still blood. To erase her entirely was cruel, vindictive. And to drag Daniel into the scheme, it was manipulation at its finest. "And what about us?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did she mention me?" His silence was the answer. That was the moment I understood the full scope of her betrayal. She hadn't just taken my dignity. She had planned to erase me, to make sure that even in death I would have no place in this family. She wanted me invisible, forgotten, discarded. But she underestimated me. I began keeping records, copies of the letters I had found in the attic, photographs of the framed picture by her bedside, notes of every cruel word she had spoken, every demand she had made. I spoke with Caroline in secret, reaching out through an old mutual friend. To my surprise, she responded. She had her own stories, her own scars carved by Eleanor's hand. Together, we pieced the puzzle of Eleanor's empire of control. Daniel, of course, resisted. He begged me to stop. "Don't do this," he said one night, his voice breaking. "She's my mother. No matter what she's done, she's still my mother." I looked at him then, really looked at him. The man I had married was gone, replaced by a boy still trapped in his mother's web, and I realized I couldn't save him, not unless he wanted to be saved. My fight wasn't for him anymore. My fight was for me. The climax came sooner than I expected. Eleanor recovered enough strength to host a family dinner, a tradition she insisted on reviving despite her frailty. She sat at the head of the table, regal as ever, her pearls catching the candlelight. Daniel sat to her right, silent and tense. I sat to her left, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding with anticipation. Halfway through the meal, she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why don't you fetch us some wine, dear? You know where the cellar is." For the first time, I met her smile with one of my own. Calm, deliberate. "No," I said softly. "If you want wine, you can ask your son." The silence that followed was suffocating. Her eyes widened, her hand tightening around her fork. Daniel looked between us, panic rising in his face, but I didn't flinch. I held her gaze, letting her see that the woman she had tormented for years was gone. In her place was someone unbreakable. She set down her fork with a sharp clink, her lips trembling with fury. "You ungrateful little—" "Ungrateful?" I interrupted, my voice steady, louder now. "Do you want to talk about ungrateful? About secrets buried in attics? About daughters erased from wills? About midnight orders and years of humiliation?" The room froze. Caroline, who had been invited under the guise of reconciliation, leaned forward. "Yes, Mother," she said quietly, but with steel in her tone. "Let's talk about that." Eleanor's face drained of color. For the first time in all the years I had known her, she looked afraid. The storm had finally broken. The silence at that table was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the ordinary silence of awkwardness or hesitation. It was the kind that carries centuries of buried truths, the kind that makes your skin prickle because you know something irreversible is about to happen. Eleanor stared at me, her lips parting as if to lash out, but no words came. Her eyes darted to Caroline, then back to me, and for once, her power seemed to slip from her grasp. Caroline leaned back in her chair, her expression hard, but there was a trembling beneath her calm exterior. She had suffered longer than I had. She had been cast out, shunned, erased from her own family's history. Now, here she was, returned, not as a prodigal daughter, begging for forgiveness, but as a witness to the truth. "You can't silence us anymore, Mother," she said firmly. "Not me. Not her, not anyone." Daniel sat frozen, caught between the women who had shaped his life, one who birthed him, and one who had once believed in him. His hands fidgeted nervously, his gaze flickering to Eleanor as though waiting for her to restore order, to reclaim the iron grip she had always wielded. but the queen had lost her crown, and I think he knew it. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the folder I had hidden there. Copies of the letters, photographs, everything I had gathered like ammunition. My heart hammered as I slid the folder onto the table, pushing it toward the center like an offering, or perhaps like a weapon. "This is the truth," I said quietly. "Your truth, Eleanor. The one you've kept locked away while destroying everyone around you. You wanted control. You wanted to be the only one with a voice. But tonight we take it back." Her hand trembled as she reached for the folder, but she didn't open it. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against it, as though by holding it down she could keep the past from escaping. "You don't understand," she whispered hoarsely. "You don't know what it was like. He betrayed me. He humiliated me. I held this family together with my bare hands while he ran to another woman. Everything I did to protect what was left." The fury in her voice cracked into something raw, something almost human. For a moment I saw her as she must have once been, a woman scorned, left alone in a world that pitied and whispered behind her back. But pity doesn't excuse cruelty. Pain doesn't justify the destruction she had rained down on everyone else. "No," I said softly. "You didn't protect this family. You destroyed it. Piece by piece, you destroyed us." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. "You destroyed me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You pushed me away because I reminded you of him. Because I looked too much like the man you hated. You let your anger swallow me whole. Do you know what it's like to grow up knowing your own mother wishes you didn't exist?" Eleanor's lips trembled. Her hand slipped from the folder. For a moment, she looked as though she might break down, collapse into the fragility of her age and her grief. But then she straightened, her eyes narrowing once again. "You think you're better than me?" she spat. "You think you can shame me, expose me, take what's mine? Everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed, it belongs to me. And I'll die before I let either of you tear it apart." Her voice cracked like a whip, reverberating through the room. But this time, I didn't flinch. I met her fury with calm. "You're right," I said softly. "It does belong to you. Your lies, your bitterness, your cruelty. They belong to you, and you can keep them. But what you don't own is me anymore. You don't own Caroline. You don't own Daniel. You can't own us, no matter what your will says, no matter how many midnight orders you give. We're free of you." For the first time in years, the words felt like wings unfolding inside me. They filled the room, louder than her cane, louder than her pearls, louder than the weight of her presence. And in that silence, I felt something shift. A chain breaking, a door opening. Eleanor's face twisted, her breath ragged. But before she could speak again, Caroline stood. She reached for the folder, pulling it close to her chest. "I'll take this to the lawyer," she said. "The will can be challenged. The truth can be spoken. I won't let you erase me anymore." Eleanor slammed her fist against the table, the sound startling in the heavy quiet. "You ungrateful children," she snarled. "After everything I endured, after everything I gave, this is how you repay me?" But Daniel finally spoke. His voice was low, shaking, but it cut through the storm. "No, Mother," he said. "This is how you repay us." The look on her face, shock, betrayal, disbelief, was almost unbearable to witness. She had lost him, the one person she had always believed would stand by her no matter what. And maybe, in some small way, I pitied her again. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. That night marked the beginning of the end. Caroline pursued the legal battle with a fire I hadn't seen in her before, and I supported her every step. We uncovered more evidence, bank records, hidden accounts, Testimonies from people who had long been silenced by Eleanor's intimidation. Piece by piece, her empire crumbled. Daniel, caught between guilt and relief, drifted further from me. He couldn't forgive his mother, but he couldn't forgive me either, for exposing her, for ripping apart the illusion he had clung to his entire life. Our marriage, already fragile, began to fracture under the weight of truths too heavy to bear. I would lie awake at night, listening to the hollow sound of his breathing beside me, knowing we were both mourning something that had never truly existed. And yet, through it all, I felt stronger. Each step toward freedom was a step toward reclaiming myself. The woman who had once stood at the altar in her simple dress, believing in love and hope. She wasn't gone. She had only been buried, waiting to rise again. The final confrontation came months later, in a sterile courtroom that smelled faintly of dust and fear. Eleanor sat across from us, her cane resting by her side, her face pale but unyielding. The judge listened as Caroline's lawyer laid out the evidence, as the letters and photographs were revealed, as witnesses spoke of Eleanor's cruelty and manipulation. And with each revelation, I saw the fortress of her pride crumble. When the ruling came, declaring the will invalid, restoring Caroline's rightful share of the estate, Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat there, her shoulders slumped, her eyes empty. For the first time, she looked small. After the hearing, I approached her. She looked up at me, her voice barely a whisper. "You think you've won," she said, "but all you've done is prove you're just like me." Her words chilled me. For days they echoed in my mind, gnawing at me. Was she right? Had my fight for freedom turned me into the very thing I despised? Was revenge just another form of control? But then I remembered the nights in the kitchen, the humiliation, the years of silence, and I realized the difference. She had used her pain to destroy. I was using mine to heal. I wasn't fighting to dominate. I was fighting to survive, to reclaim, to live. Still, her prophecy lingered, because victories in family wars are never clean. They leave scars that whisper long after the battle is done. Daniel and I separated quietly, without lawyers or shouting. He packed his things one evening while I stood in the doorway watching, too tired to beg him to stay. We loved each other once, but love without courage is just an illusion, and I couldn't live in illusions anymore. I moved into a small apartment overlooking the river, a place where the air felt lighter, freer. Caroline visited often, her laughter filling the spaces that had once echoed with loneliness. We were building something new, not perfect, not without pain, but real. And as for Eleanor, she stayed in that grand house, alone with her cane and her pearls and her ghosts. People said she became quieter after the trial, less demanding, less visible. But I knew better. She hadn't changed. She had only been defeated, and in some ways, that was enough. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of her tapping her cane against the floor, calling me into the kitchen. I wake up sweating, my heart racing, only to remember that I am free. The woman who once cooked at midnight, trembling under her gaze, no longer exists. She died the day I chose to fight back, and in her place stands someone new, someone whole. Here is the final approximately 1,550 words of your story, bringing it to its emotional climax, resolution, and meaningful closing. More like mission. Freedom is a strange thing. When you've been trapped for years, by fear, by silence, by someone else's control, you imagine that freedom will feel like fireworks, like triumph, like the sudden opening of a cage. But in truth, it feels quieter, almost fragile. It creeps in slowly like sunlight through a cracked curtain, warming the spaces you had long thought would remain cold. That's what my life became after Eleanor's empire of control finally collapsed. A slow thaw, a steady return of light. But freedom is never without its shadows. Even as I built a new life, Her presence lingered in me. The sound of her cane still echoed in my mind. The memory of midnight humiliation still woke me from restless sleep. Trauma doesn't vanish just because the source has been cut away. It leaves fingerprints, invisible but permanent. And those fingerprints shaped the way I saw the world, the way I trusted or struggled to trust again. Caroline was my anchor in those first months. She had lost so much more than I had: her childhood, her sense of belonging, her place in the world. And yet she rose from the ashes of our family war with a resilience I couldn't help but admire. Sometimes she would come over with a bottle of wine and we'd sit by the river, our voices low, unraveling the knots of the past. "She stole our years," Caroline would say, staring into the dark water. "But she won't steal what's left." We promised each other that night we would never become like her, that we would never let bitterness define us, never let betrayal chain us to cruelty. And yet, I often wondered if such promises could truly be kept. Because pain, once planted, has a way of blooming when you least expect it. Daniel and I, we never returned to each other. We met once more in a quiet cafe near the courthouse, months after the dust had settled. He looked older, more tired, his eyes heavy with regret. He told me he was moving to another state, starting over. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice low, "but I hope someday you'll remember me as more than her son." I wanted to tell him that I would, that I could separate the man I loved from the boy who clung to his mother's shadow. But I couldn't lie, not anymore. All I could do was nod, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes, and watch him leave. In some ways, losing him hurt more than losing Eleanor's approval. But maybe it wasn't loss at all. Maybe it was release. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found work at a small bakery near my apartment, where the mornings smelled of cinnamon and bread, and where people smiled without hidden daggers in their words. The simple rhythm of kneading dough, of serving coffee, of wiping flour from my hands, it was healing in ways I hadn't expected. For years, cooking had been a weapon used against me, a symbol of servitude. Now it became mine again. Not a midnight punishment, but a choice, a craft, a love. One day, a young couple came into the bakery. The wife was visibly pregnant, her husband fussing over her with tender concern. They laughed as they ordered, their hands brushing together on the counter. Watching them, something in my chest ached. Not jealousy, not bitterness. Something gentler. A reminder of what I had once hoped marriage could be. A reminder that love, real love, wasn't about control or silence or fear. It was about partnership, about choosing each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. I went home that evening and stood by the window, the city lights flickering across the water. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream again. Not of revenge, not of escape, but of possibility. Months turned into a year. Eleanor grew frailer, her name mentioned less and less in whispers around town. I heard through Caroline that she spent most of her days in that grand empty house, her pearls gathering dust in a drawer, her cane tapping slower and slower against the floor. I didn't visit her. I didn't need to. She had already taken enough of me, and I refused to give her any more. But when the news came that she had passed away, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing at first. Just silence. As though the battle had finally ended, but the soldiers had long since gone home. Caroline called me, her voice trembling, asking if I would attend the funeral. I said yes, not for Eleanor, but for us, for closure. The church was nearly empty that day. A handful of old acquaintances, a scattering of relatives who had kept their distance for years. Daniel was there, standing alone in the corner, his face pale, his eyes red. When he saw me, he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of all that had passed between us. I nodded back. The service was short. The priest speaking of virtues Eleanor had never lived by, kindness, compassion, forgiveness. I sat in the pew, my hands folded, and wondered if anyone else in that room felt the irony. But then I reminded myself, funerals aren't for the dead. They're for the living, for the ones left behind, trying to make sense of the void. When it was over, Caroline and I stood together at the graveside, the cold wind whipping through our coats. She reached for my hand, her grip strong. "She doesn't own us anymore," she whispered. And in that moment, I believed her. Walking away from that grave, I didn't feel like a victor or a survivor. I felt like a woman who had lived through fire and emerged scarred, but standing. Stronger, perhaps. Wiser, certainly. And deeply, painfully human. In the months that followed, I often returned to the river, sitting with a notebook in my lap, writing down the pieces of my story. Not just for myself, but for anyone who might one day need to hear it. Because stories like mine are not rare. They live in the quiet corners of countless homes, behind smiling family portraits, beneath layers of silence, and sometimes all it takes is one voice breaking that silence to set others free. If you're listening to me now, if you've followed my story this far, maybe you've felt some of those chains yourself. Maybe you've known the sting of betrayal, the weight of silence, the cruelty of someone who should have been family. If you have, I want you to know this. You are not powerless. You may feel small, invisible, trapped. But inside you is a strength you haven't yet seen. The same strength that carried me from midnight kitchens to riverfront freedom. The same strength that allowed me to say, finally, this ends with me. Revenge, family drama, betrayal. They're words that sound like chapters in a story, but in reality, they're scars etched into skin, into memory. And yet scars are proof of healing, proof that you endured, proof that you survived. I am no longer the woman my mother-in-law forced to cook at midnight. I am no longer the wife who begged her husband for protection he would never give. I am no longer the daughter-in-law whose worth was measured by cruelty. I am me, whole, free, and finally, enough. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of your own journey, if it gave you even a flicker of strength, then I ask you, please share it. Like this video, subscribe so you can walk with me through more stories like this, and leave a comment. Tell me your story. Let your voice be heard. Because the more we speak, the more we heal. Together we can end the silence.